What's up, everyone? Chris Yandel here for Channelfireball.com, and welcome to another edition of Audio Articles, where we bring you articles written by the top Magic the Gathering pros in audio form, so you can listen on the go, wherever and whenever you want, for free, Monday through Friday. We've also got a lot of really great content on YouTube, so make sure you head over to YouTube, search for Channel Fireball, ring the bell next to the subscribe button so you get access to all the videos that our pros are making just for you. If you want to have easier access to the podcast and you have an iPhone, ask Siri to play the most recent episode of Channel Fireball's podcast, and it'll go ahead and start for you. We're also on iTunes and Spotify. Let's go ahead and get into the meat of the episode. Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa is going to talk about sideboarding and when you need to change up your plan. Thanks for being with us today, and here is When to Deviate from Your Sideboarding Guide by Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa. As a general rule, people love sideboard guides. Whenever I write about a deck, the first reply is usually either, "Thank you for the sideboard guide," or "Where's the sideboard guide?" I understand the appeal. We certainly don't want to risk having to make a decision on the fly and be wrong if it's something that we can already memorize or write down beforehand. That said, you should know that sideboard guides are really only guidelines and not hard rules. They're meant to give you an idea of what's good and what's bad in a matchup, and not to serve as a replacement for thinking. There are a lot of tournaments where I sideboard differently against every single one of my opponents, depending on one factor or another. Today I'm going to talk about the factors that should lead you to sideboard differently than you normally do. I'm not saying that you should do away with sideboard guides completely. I use them too. I'm just saying you should not stop thinking just because you have a sideboard guide. For me, there are three main characteristics that'll make me deviate from a guide. Number one, are you on the play or are you on the draw? This is the most common factor, and some authors even incorporate it into their sideboard guides. I try to do this when the difference is striking and the matchup is very common. That said, it's not done nearly enough. There's a world of difference between being on the play or on the draw, and it's very likely that you want a different configuration for each one. As a general rule, whenever you're on the play, you're able to execute your own game plan. When you're on the draw, you're forced to react to their game plan. Let's take, for example, a combo deck, Black-Red Reanimator and Legacy. Black-Red Reanimator is very much a quote-unquote all-in deck. You're trying to win on turns 1 or 2 most of the time. If you're on the play post-board, then your main plan is still the same. You're trying to brute force a combo before they can cast a hate spell, and you don't want to dilute your deck too much because the new plan is the old plan. For example, you can win a game before Deathrite Shaman loses Summoning Sickness, or before they can play a counterbalance. If you're on the draw, however, you have to accept that you might not be able to combo immediately, and you change your deck a little to reflect that. This might mean, for example, adding Grim Lavamancer to deal with Deathrite Shaman, or perhaps taking out some combo pieces and bringing in a couple of Reverent Silence to deal with counterbalance. In Standard, we recently had a really good example of this in the Teamer Mirror. Whenever you were on the play, the best strategy was to execute your own game plan. You wanted to play Servant of the Conduit or Longtusk Cub on turn 2. If you're on the draw, however, you couldn't afford to let their 2-drop live, you had to kill it. Your own game plan would just be too slow, so you had to become more reactive and stop theirs. This meant that on the play we had Longtusk Cubs in our deck, but on the draw we had Abrades instead because we just wanted to abrade their 2-drop anyway. On the play, we were proactive, but on the draw, we tried to be more disruptive. This also happens with control decks versus aggro decks, where the control player can usually afford more slots dedicated to card advantage if they're on the play than if they're on the draw. If you're playing blue-white and you're on the play against red-black, you're fine having Search for Azcanta in your deck post-board because there's little you want to do on turn 2 anyway. They haven't done anything, so you don't have to react to it. This means that you're free to just execute your own game plan and play your own card advantage engine on turn 2. If you're on the draw, things tend to change a little bit. Suddenly, playing a Search for Azcanta means that you didn't cast Seal Away on their Scrapheap Scrounger or Karazev Skyship Raider. It also means that you couldn't Essence Scatter or Syncopate a Goblin Chain Whirler or Pia Nalar. Often, it means both of those things, and you're just too far behind. A lot of the time, you have Search for Azcanta in your opening hand versus Black-Red. If you're on the draw, you can't even play it on turn 2 because you have to react to what they're doing. At this point, I'd rather just not have them in my deck. The same is true for most counterspells. If you're on the play, you can afford to counter things every turn. But if you're on the draw, then you'll often have to react in some other way to permanents that are already in play, which means that you won't be able to keep mana up every time. And because of that, cards like Disallow are much better versus aggressive decks on the play than on the draw, because you can afford to keep 3 mana up on turn 3 if you're on the play, but you can't afford to do that on the draw. You also have to pay attention to your mana curve. If you're on the draw, your 3 mana cards have to match up well against their 4 mana cards, whereas if you're on the play, then you have to match their 3 mana cards. This is really important for counterspells. For example, if your opponent has 3 mana cards that you'd like to counter, then Disallow will be good enough on the play, but not on the draw. If I'm playing blue-white against red-black, then I think Disallow is a better card than Essence Scatter on the play, since it can counter Chandra and Karn. But I have Essence Scatter over Disallow if I'm on the draw, because I want to be able to counter Pia Nalar and, to a lesser extent, Goblin Chain Whirler. If you're on the draw, cards that can catch you up are usually better, whereas if you're on the play, then 1-for-1 answers are often good enough. For example, if I'm on the play versus an aggressive deck, I might not need all my Settle the Wreckages or Fumigates. I plan on countering or killing every creature they play anyway. If I'm on the draw, I might not have time to counter or kill every creature they play single-handedly, at which point I need a sweeper to get back in the game. Therefore, I could reasonably take out sweepers on the play and add sweepers on the draw. Another type of card that gets much better on the play is Planeswalkers. Planeswalkers thrive on being played into an empty board, or an advantageous board. And if you're on the play, you're much more likely to have an empty board by the time you play them. If you're playing an aggressive deck mirror, then it's common to have many Planeswalkers on the play and few or none on the draw. For example, we did this with Chandra Torch of Defiance in the red mirrors, or with Nissa Steward of Elements in the Temur mirror. If you were on the play, you could often play Nissa and plus it, and your opponent wouldn't have a way to kill it. On the draw, they'd already have a Rogue Refiner or a Whirler Virtuoso in play, both of which represent lethal damage to Nissa, which meant that it wasn't worth it. This is also true in Limited. Take, for example, our last GP top 4 with Dominaria Draft. We were 3rd in the Swiss, so we knew that we were going to be on the draw in our matches, because whoever has the higher seed gets to choose and everybody always chooses to play. This impacted our drafting and deck building decisions too. We knew that, for example, we might want slightly more defensive cards and not to fall behind early. Cards like Caligo Skin Witch and Fungal Infection rose in priority a little bit. Ben was talking about how he really likes Dark Bargain in the format, but he wouldn't prioritize them in this draft specifically. He would specifically not highly pick a second one, because he wouldn't even play 2 in his main deck on the draw, whereas if he was guaranteed to be on the play, he'd both pick and play 2. Another thing that you can do is take out a land, because you'll have an extra card to find your land drops. Imagine this scenario. You have 25 lands in a 60-card deck, and you want to make your first 4 land drops. If you're on the play, you'll see 10 cards, and the chance of finding at least 4 lands is 67%. But if you're on the draw, the chance is 76%. If you cut a land on the draw, then the chance is 72%, still more than with 25 lands on the play. In fact, you could even cut another land down to 23, and you'd still be more likely to hit your first 4 land drops on the draw than with 25 on the play. Of course, it's not as clear-cut, as you're more likely to mulligan with fewer lands than without, but even if you do have to mulligan, it's not as bad if you're on the draw. Number 2, how do they play? Each person's going to play the game in a different way, and sometimes you can exploit that by sideboarding differently, either because you know them and their playstyle, or because of something that they did in games 1 or 2. For example, at GP Toronto, I played against Martin Yuza. I was playing blue-white cycling, and he was playing red-black. I've played versus Martin a lot before, and I know he's extremely conservative and will go to great lengths to not be blown out by certain cards. He confirmed this in Game 1 by attacking into Cellular Wreckage with only 1 creature, when most players would attack with 2. So in Game 2, I took out all the settles. This isn't what I would usually do against red-black decks, at least on the play, but I knew he would play against them all the time, even potentially in a spot in which he shouldn't, so their value would be greatly diminished. Now, if Martin had been playing mono red, then I would have kept him in anyway because you just need him. But against a very conservative red-black player, I felt like I could do without him. I was able to do this because I know Martin, but you don't necessarily need to. One of my favorite sideboarding stories is when we were playing blue-green Scapeshift, and our plan was to take out Jace the Mind Sculptor against Zoo because it died too easily. Then, when Gabe Walls played against the guy in the GP, he realized in Game 1 that the guy wasn't actually attacking his Jaces. Jace was a good card, and the only problem was that it died easily, so if the opponent wasn't killing it, then it was just a good card. Our sideboarding sheet said that against Zoo, you take out 2 Jace the Mind Sculptor, but Gabe not only kept the main deck Jaces, but he actually added a 3rd Jace from his sideboard just based on the way his opponent played. And number 3, what does their list look like? Lists are almost never identical to each other, and it's a mistake to sideboard in the same way versus 2 decks only because they are the same archetype. For example, take mono red splashing Scrounger and mono red without it. Both decks are quote-unquote mono red, but you should sideboard differently against them. If they have Scrounger, then I like Forsake the Worldly, and I'll board into multiples, but I don't like Fumigate. If they don't have Scrounger, then I don't like Forsake the Worldly, and I like Fumigate. What if they have Scrounger but don't have any other artifacts? Well, then I'll evaluate on the fly, but the important thing is that I'm actually thinking about it, rather than just following the guide blindly. The same is true for mono green. You might have mono green in your sideboarding sheet, but what happens when they're splashing for Scrounger, or for blue cards? Certainly there's a chance that your plan would be different, but people often fail to adapt to that. I was a victim of this in the last Pro Tour. I was playing the blue-green Karn deck, and we had sideboard plans for black-green Snake. Then I played against an opponent who was playing a much more Planeswalker-heavy version of black-green. He didn't actually have Snakes. He had his own Karns, Nissas, and Vraskas. I looked at a black-green deck in front of me, and I sideboarded like I sideboarded against black-green Snake, which included bringing in 2 Brawl's expertise, which were just incredibly awful against his deck. I should have realized that the differences in his deck meant that my sideboard guide against black-green wouldn't really apply, and I shouldn't have sideboarded that card in. Another example, in Pro Tour Kyoto, we played mono red and we had a sideboard plan that we thought was pretty good and included removing Village Messenger, everyone did this, and going bigger than your opponent. Then in the quarterfinals, I played versus Seth Manfield. We knew his deck list because it was the top 8, and we saw that he had the ability to go even bigger than we did. At the same time, he had no sweepers, no Pias, and no way to punish us for going wide. For example, we had Pia and Savage Alliance to stop him from doing it. And because of this, we decided to deviate from our plan. Instead of taking out the 1/1s and on-crop crashers, we just kept them all and tried to go under him. In our sideboarding sheet, we were assuming that mono-red players would have ways for punishing us for having a lot of small creatures, but once we knew that he didn't, we could adapt and deviate from it. Bonus track. Do you have enough time? This only affects a subset of decks, but sometimes the time on the clock will make me deviate from my plan. If I'm blue-white, for example, I don't normally board History of Benalia in against blue-black midrange, but if I have 5 minutes on the clock, then I might go ahead and do it because I know I won't win in 5 minutes with just 4 Teferis. It rarely comes up, but I feel like it's at least worth mentioning. So to sum it up, do read the sideboard guides, but don't be a slave to them. Know that they're only guidelines and that you should deviate based on what's happening in the match, your opponent's list, and how they play. That does it for this episode of Audio Articles. Make sure to head over to channelfireball.com and leave Paulo a comment about what you thought about today's article, or you can hit him up on Twitter at PVDDR. Also, make sure to check out cfbevents.com. You'll find all the information about the upcoming GPs there. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks for being with us today, and I hope to see you soon. And until then,